The motorcycle had no right to be beautiful, and yet it was. Not in the way that showroom machines are beautiful, polished and perfumed, and designed to be admired from a safe distance, but in the way that old things are beautiful when they have been lived in so completely that they start to carry the life of their owner, the way skin carries the sun. It was a 1971 Triumph Bonneville, and its chrome had the particular silver of something that has been buffed by hand. So many times the metal itself seems to remember every pass of the cloth. The tank was painted a deep, weather-beaten burgundy that had faded unevenly at the edges. Darker near the center where the paint had been protected from the years, lighter at the seams where time had done what time always does. The leather seat had cracked along the left side and been repaired with a length of saddle-stitched rawhide by a man named Des, who worked out of a tack shop in rural Tennessee, and charged $40 for the best leather work within 300 miles. The exhaust pipes were original, which meant they were old, which meant they glowed amber when the engine was warm, and sang a low combustive note that people who understood engines stopped what they were doing to listen to. Cole Drayden understood engines. He had understood them since he was 8 years old, and his father, before the world took him, had placed a child's palm flat against a running block and told him to feel the heartbeat. He had never forgotten the instruction or the feeling, and every motorcycle, every engine, every machine he had touched since then had been an extension of that first lesson. That things built with intention and care have a pulse, and that pulse is worth respecting. Cole was 39 years old, and he worked as a senior technician at a mid-size logistics company in Harnett Falls, a town that sat in the long shadow of the mountains, with the particular self-possessed quietness of places that have learned not to expect much from the wider world. He was not a handsome man in a conventional sense. He was lean and wind-worked, with the kind of face that looked like it had been shaped by weather rather than genetics, deep-set eyes that were a color, somewhere between gray and green depending on the light, and hands that were permanently stained in the creases with the honest residue of his work, no matter how long he scrubbed. He was a single father to a boy named Jack, who was 11 years old, and had his mother's dark eyes and his father's habit of going very quiet when something mattered to him enormously. Jack's mother had died when Jack was 3, not dramatically, not in a way that made a story. Anyone wanted to hear twice, but quietly, and without sufficient warning, the way illness sometimes takes people, before the people around them have finished believing it can. Her name had been Miriam. Cole still said her name out loud. Sometimes when he was alone, not from the grief exactly, but from the conviction that names keep people present, and that presence is something worth fighting for. He raised Jack in a 2-bedroom house on the east side of Harnett Falls that needed a new roof and had a backyard big enough for a boy to disappear into on summer afternoons, and he did it with the systematic, unfussy competence of a man who has accepted that love, in its most functional form, is simply showing up every day with everything you have. The Founders Day Showcase was the kind of event that Harnett Falls held on to with both hands every year, a 2-day outdoor fair spread across the town square and the adjacent parking lot of the old feed mill, with food trucks and craft stalls, and a classic vehicle exhibition that drew collectors and enthusiasts from 4 counties. Cole had brought the Bonneville every year for 6 years, not to compete or to impress, but because the motorcycle had belonged to his father, and because the exhibition was one of the few places in Harnett Falls where it was acceptable for a grown man to stand beside something he loved and feel that love without having to explain or justify it. He parked in his usual spot near the northern end of the exhibition row, beside a 1968 BSA Lightning, owned by retired postal worker named Gerald, who always brought a folding chair and a thermos, and treated the event with the ceremonial gravity of a religious observance. Jack was with him, wearing the jacket Cole had bought him 2 sizes too large, so he would grow into it, carrying a paper bag of kettle corn, with the focused devotionist of who has decided that this specific food requires their complete attention. Cole had just finished adjusting the kickstand on an uneven patch of asphalt when he heard the crowd shift. The small collective rearrangement that happens when someone important enters a space. Nolan Crest arrived the way he always arrived, slightly ahead of himself, trailing an atmosphere of expectation like a weather system. He was 46 years old, the founder and CEO of Crest Mobility Solutions, a company that had built a regional empire on electric vehicle infrastructure, and had recently been the subject of a profile in a national business publication that described him as visionary, in the particular breathless way that publications describe men who have made large amounts of money in a short time. He was not from Harnett Falls. He had moved here 3 years ago when the company relocated its operational hub, and he had brought with him the particular brand of confidence that accumulates in people who have been told they are exceptional for long enough that they have stopped questioning whether it might be a construction rather than a fact. He was walking the exhibition row with 2 members of his staff and a local city councilman who laughed at every remark he made with the slightly too quick timing of a man who has decided that agreeing with powerful people is its own career strategy. Crest stopped when he reached Cole's motorcycle. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, that it looked like something a man dragged out of a river. His 2 staff members laughed. The councilman laughed. Cole, who was crouched behind the rear wheel, checking the chain tension, stood up slowly. He looked at Nolan Crest, the way a man looks at something he is deciding how to categorize. He said nothing. He simply looked, and that silence had a quality to it that made Crest's laughter falter almost imperceptibly. A single missed beat, like a metronome disturbed by a passing truck, before he composed himself and moved on down the row, already talking about something else. What Nolan Crest did not know, what almost nobody in Harnett Falls knew, because Cole was not a man who announced things about himself, was the history that the Bonneville carried in its frame and its paint, and the very particular wear pattern on its throttle grip. He did not know, because he had not asked, and because asking would have required him to treat the machine as something other than an object for ridicule, that the motorcycle had been built in the Meriden factory in England in 1971 and had arrived in the United States as part of a batch ordered by a racing stable in California that competed in endurance events along the West Coast circuit. He did not know that the motorcycle had placed second at the 1973 Pacific Coast Classic, ridden by a man named Thomas Drayden, who was 24 years old at the time, and was widely regarded by the people who followed that particular circuit as one of the most naturally gifted riders of his generation. A man who could read a road, the way some people read music, intuitively, and completely, feeling where it was going before he arrived there. He did not know that Thomas Drayden had retired from racing at 27, after a crash left him with a repaired femur and a permanent limp and a clarity about the finite nature of luck that most people only achieve much later in life. He did not know that Thomas had kept the motorcycle, maintained it meticulously for over 4 decades, and that it had sat in a garage in a small house in eastern Tennessee, where a boy named Cole had grown up watching his father treat the machine with the kind of careful love that teaches children, by example, what things are worth honoring. Thomas Drayden had died 11 months ago at 74, in the same house where Cole had grown up. He had died with his affairs in careful order. He had been a precise man, organized in the way that people who have experienced chaos tend to become, and he had left the Bonneville to Cole, with a letter written in a longhand so deliberate, it looked like a document rather than a note. The letter said, among other things, that the motorcycle had never needed anything from anyone who didn't understand it, and that Cole should not apologize for it to people who looked at it with the eyes of someone counting cost rather than value. Cole had read the letter 4 times in the first week, and had not been able to read it again since. Because some things don't get easier with repetition, they simply get more precise in the way they land. He had put the letter in the same fireproof box, where he kept Jack's birth certificate, and Miriam's death certificate, and the deed to the house, which struck him sometimes as a kind of accidental poetry, that the documents marking the most important arrivals and departures of his life all lived together in the same small steel box. He had brought the Bonneville back from Tennessee in the bed of his truck, covered with a canvas tarp and cushioned with moving blankets, and he had spent 3 weekends giving it what his father would have called a proper going over, not a restoration, because it didn't need restoring, but a sustained and respectful attentiveness that asked nothing of the machine except that it remain itself. What happened next occurred, not because Cole sought it out, but because truth has a way of surfacing in proportion to the pressure applied to keep it down. The Founders Day Showcase had, as part of its second-day programming, a panel discussion on the history of American motorsport, hosted by the County Historical Society in the covered pavilion beside the feed mill. Cole had been invited to participate 3 years running and had declined each time, not from false modesty, but from a genuine preference for standing beside the machine rather than talking about it. This year, however, Gerald, the retired postal worker with the BSA Lightning and the folding chair, had volunteered Cole's name without asking, and the Historical Society had already printed the program, and Cole had the kind of integrity that makes a man honor a commitment even when it was made on his behalf without his knowledge, because the alternative involves disappointing people who have done nothing wrong. He arrived at the pavilion with Jack, who sat in the front row with his kettle corn, replaced by a bottle of water and his full attention installed. Nolan Crest was also in the audience. He had been brought by the councilman as a gesture of civic hospitality, and was seated in the second row with the arranged posture of a man who expects to be bored, but doesn't want his boredom to be visible. Cole spoke for 22 minutes. He had not prepared remarks in the formal sense. He had thought on the drive over about what he actually wanted to say, which is a different and considerably more powerful form of preparation. He talked about the Bonneville, not as a vehicle but as a document, a physical record of a specific era of engineering philosophy in which the relationship between rider and machine was understood to be a conversation rather than a command. He talked about the metallurgical decisions made at the Meriden factory in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the compromises and the inspired solutions, the particular character that a parallel twin engine develops after decades of use that no new engine can replicate, because character in machines as in people is a function of accumulated experience rather than manufacture. Then, quietly and without theater, he talked about his father. He talked about the 1973 Pacific Coast Classic, and at this point one of the Historical Society members, a woman named Dr. Patricia Shores, who had written 2 books on American motorsport history, sat forward in her chair with an expression of someone who has just heard a familiar name in an unexpected context. He showed on his phone a photograph he had found in his father's things, a black and white image of a young man on a Bonneville at the finish line of a race, arms raised, the number 14 visible on the fairing, the crowd a blur of motion in the background. Dr. Shores asked if she could see the photograph more closely. She looked at it for a long time, then she told the audience, in a voice that had gone very careful and very deliberate, that Thomas Drayden's second-place finish at the 1973 Pacific Coast Classic had been the subject of a significant re-examination by racing historians in recent years, because the documentation from that race suggested the first-place result had involved a technical infringement that had never been formally adjudicated, and that there was now a credible and well-supported argument in the historical record that Thomas Drayden had, in any fair accounting, actually won that race. The room was silent, in the way rooms go silent when something real has just entered them. Cole looked at the photograph on his phone, his father's arms raised, His father's young face turned toward a sky that had been the sky of a day in 1973 that Cole had never seen, and yet somehow knew, and he felt the weight of it settle into him not like a blow, but like a hand placed gently on his shoulder. Jack, in the front row, was watching his father with an expression that 11-year-old boys rarely allow themselves. Open and unhidden and full of something that had not yet acquired a name, but that would later, when he was old enough to name it accurately, turn out to be pride in its most foundational form. In the second row, Nolan Crest sat very still. He was a man who had built his identity on the ability to assess value at a glance, to know what things were worth before other people caught up with the calculation. He was sitting 3 rows behind a motorcycle he had described, publicly and loudly, as something dragged from a river, a motorcycle that had, it now appeared, been ridden by a man who had won a race that history had spent 50 years in the process of correctly recording. He said nothing. There was nothing available to say that would not make the situation measurably worse. He looked at the photograph, still displayed on the screen at the front of the pavilion. And he looked at Cole Drayden, and he looked at the motorcycle parked outside in the afternoon light. And somewhere in the calculation he had been so certain of, a number quietly changed. After the session, Cole walked back to the Bonneville, with Jack beside him. Jack asked if great-grandpa Thomas had really won. Cole said the evidence suggested he had. Jack thought about this for a moment, with the focused seriousness of someone processing a fact that will become load-bearing in their understanding of who they are. Then he asked if they could go get food. Cole said yes. He put his hand on the warm tank of the Bonneville for a single moment, the way his father had taught him, palm flat, feeling the residual heat, and then he pulled the cover over it, and they went to find something to eat, and the afternoon was ordinary and golden, and entirely sufficient, and the motorcycle stood in the fading light holding its history the way it always had, quietly and without apology, waiting for whoever had the patience and the character to ask.